Eleanor Hayes set her suitcase down on a stranger's porch, lifted her chin so no one could see her trembling, and knocked on the door of the only lit house she could find in the dark. She had not eaten in 2 days. The man who promised her a future had taken her last dollar and disappeared. And the rain had soaked through her only coat. But she did not cry. She knocked again, harder this time, because Eleanor Hayes had decided that if the world was going to break her, it was going to have to work for it. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment below. Tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The rain came in sideways that Tuesday evening, the kind of Montana rain that didn't ask permission before it soaked through every layer a person was wearing. Eleanor Hayes stood at the end of Willow Creek's only main road and counted what she had left. 1 suitcase, 1 carpet bag, 14 cents. A letter of introduction from a pastor in Ohio who had never actually met the man she was supposed to marry. And the name of a ranch, Whitaker Ranch, written on a piece of paper that had started to bleed ink in the rain. She folded the paper carefully and pressed it into her coat pocket. She had arrived that morning on the westbound stage from Billings, stepping down onto the muddy street of Willow Creek, with the particular kind of careful hope that a woman carries when she has decided to start over. She had worn her best dress, the green one with the ivory buttons, because first impressions mattered, and she had wanted Richard Cole to see her and know that she was a serious woman. A capable woman. A woman worth choosing. Richard Cole had not been at the stage stop. Eleanor had waited an hour, then 2, standing in front of the general store, while the townspeople moved around her with the practiced indifference of people who had seen too many mail-order brides arrive and too many of them leave. At the 3-hour mark, she asked the storekeeper if he knew a Richard Cole. The man's face did something complicated. He looked at her dress, then at her suitcase, then at her face. "Cole left," the storekeeper said. "Left." Eleanor repeated the word carefully, the way a person repeats a word they understand, but cannot yet believe. "Left for where?" "Left Willow Creek." The man shrugged and turned back to stacking flour sacks. "Pulled out yesterday morning, took his horse and whatever he could carry." Eleanor stood very still. "Did he leave a message? A letter? Anything?" The storekeeper didn't even look up. "Not for anyone I know of." She walked outside. She stood in the middle of the street. She breathed in. She breathed out. And she made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would not let herself fall apart in public. Whatever happened next, whatever she felt about Richard Cole and his promises and his letter, and the 3 months she had spent believing in a future he had invented, none of that would happen here in the mud in front of strangers. She went back inside and asked the storekeeper if there was any work available in Willow Creek. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Any kind," she said. "I cook, I clean, I sew. I can manage accounts if needed." He shook his head. "Town's small. Everyone's got family." She tried the diner. The woman who ran it looked at Eleanor with something close to pity and explained that she already had 2 nieces helping. She tried the hotel. The owner said he was considering closing down for the season. She tried the church where the pastor's wife offered her a bowl of soup and a great deal of sympathy, but nothing that would keep her fed past tomorrow. By evening, Eleanor had 14 cents and a list of every business in Willow Creek that did not need her. She was sitting on the step outside the post office trying to calculate how far 14 cents would take her, and not liking the answer when an older man with a white beard and a limping walk stopped in front of her. He looked at her suitcase. He looked at her face. He pulled his coat tighter against the rain. "You're the Cole girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I was supposed to marry Richard Cole. He doesn't appear to have been aware of that." The old man made a short sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder. "Name's Garrett. I drive supplies out to the ranches. You looking for work?" "Desperately," Eleanor said without embarrassment. There was no dignity left in pretending otherwise. Garrett scratched his beard. "Whitaker Ranch is about 6 miles east. Thomas Whitaker lost his cook 3 weeks ago. Woman had to go back to her sister in Wyoming. He's got a son, a ranch hand crew, and an old father who barely eats anymore. Word is, He'd pay $30 a month for someone who can cook a proper meal and keep the house from falling to ruin. He paused. It's a hard posting. Man doesn't talk much, keeps to himself, doesn't like things complicated. Eleanor looked at the rain. She looked at the 14 cents in her palm. Can you take me there? She asked. Garrett looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. Wagon's out back. I'll take you as far as the ranch road. She arrived at Whitaker Ranch in the dark. Garrett let her off at the gate, pointed toward the light in the main house window, and told her she was on her own from there. She thanked him and walked up the road with her suitcase and her carpetbag rain soaking through her coat mud pulling at her boots. The house was large, solid, built to last. Someone had cared about it once. She could see that in the quality of the lumber, in the width of the porch, in the way the structure sat on the land, like it had grown there naturally. But the care had stopped at some point. The porch boards needed paint. The garden beds along the front had gone to weeds. Firewood was stacked in neat rows that was clearly still maintained, but the small details, the things that turned a building into a home, had been quietly neglected. Eleanor knocked. No one came. She knocked again, louder. From inside she heard heavy footsteps, the scrape of a chair, a door opening somewhere down a hallway. Then the front door opened. Thomas Whitaker was not what she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that weather and hard work make honest and quiet. His hair was dark, going to gray at the temples. His eyes were brown, the careful measuring kind, and they looked at her with the flat wariness of a man who had learned that unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. He looked at her suitcase. He looked at her soaked coat. He looked at her face. He said nothing. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I was told you're looking for a cook and housekeeper. I'm looking for a position. I arrived in Willow Creek this morning, and the circumstances that brought me here didn't work out. Garrett told me you might need help. I can start immediately." Thomas Whitaker stared at her for a long moment. The rain was still falling. Eleanor didn't move. "Where are you from?" he finally said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, deliberate, like a man who chose his words the way he chose which ground to walk on. "Cincinnati originally. Most recently from a farm outside Columbus, Ohio." "You ever cooked for a crew before?" "I managed the household for my father's farm from the time I was 14. I cooked 3 meals a day for 8 men every harvest season for 6 years. Another pause. He looked at the rain, then back at her. $30 a month, he said. Room in the house, your own lamp. Sundays are yours afternoon. I need breakfast ready before the crew heads out, which is 5 in the morning. Supper by 6. Whatever else needs doing around the house, you work out with me." "That's acceptable," Eleanor said. "One more thing." His eyes were direct. Not unkind, but direct. "This is a working arrangement, nothing else. My house has enough in it already without any misunderstanding about what you're here for." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Whitaker, I came to Willow Creek to marry a man who left before I arrived. The last thing I need right now is another misunderstanding about what I'm here for." She picked up her suitcase. "Which way is the kitchen?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement. Something quieter than that. He stepped aside and let her in. The kitchen told her everything she needed to know about how the ranch had been living. The stove was cold. The pot hanging over it was empty, and had been for a while. She could tell by the dried residue at the bottom that hadn't been properly cleaned. The pantry had supplies enough to work with, but they were disorganized in the way that things go when no one is managing them with intention. Flour was stored next to boot oil. A sack of dried beans had split at the corner and been patched with a piece of twine. The good cast iron skillet was shoved to the back of a shelf behind several lesser pans. Eleanor set down her suitcase. She put on an apron she found hanging near the back door. She started a fire in the stove. She worked by feel in the unfamiliar kitchen, finding what she needed, establishing what was where. She had done this before, moved into a space that wasn't hers, and made it functional. There was a skill to it that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with attention. She found a ham bone with enough meat still on it. She found onions, potatoes, carrots, a bundle of dried thyme. She found beef broth that someone had put up last winter. She put everything into the big pot and let it work. While it cooked, she cleaned the kitchen. Not dramatically, not as a statement. Just steadily, the way she did everything, because a clean kitchen worked better than a dirty one, and that was the only logic she needed. By the time the stew was ready, it was past 9 o'clock. Eleanor set a bowl on the table and sat down to eat her own portion. She had just lifted the first spoonful when she heard boots on the back porch. Thomas Whitaker came in from cold smelling of rain and cattle and cold air. He stopped when he registered what he was smelling. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot on the stove. He looked at the clean counter. He looked at the bowl on the table. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Who made this stew?" he asked. "I did," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and served himself a bowl. He ate in silence. Eleanor finished her portion and started washing the dishes. After a long while, he said, "This is my mother's recipe." Eleanor stopped. She turned to look at him. "I used thyme and ham bone," she said. "It's a common combination. My mother added a pinch of nutmeg," he said. "Did you add nutmeg?" Eleanor thought back. She had found a small jar labeled in faded writing, shaken a little into her palm, smelled it. "Yes," she said. "I wasn't sure what it was, but it smelled right." Thomas Whitaker set down his spoon. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "Your room is the first on the left at the top of the stairs," he said. "There's an extra quilt in the chest. The stove takes birchwood, best the bin on the porch." He stood, carried his bowl to the counter, and walked out of the kitchen. Eleanor watched him go. She didn't understand everything that had just happened, but she understood that something had shifted, something small and careful and not yet named. She finished the dishes, banked the fire, and went upstairs to the first room on the left. She was up before 4 the next morning. The house was dark and cold and deeply quiet. Eleanor moved through it carefully, learning the geography of it in the dark, where the stairs creaked, where the kitchen door stuck, where the wood bin was, and how to fill the stove without waking the household. By 4:30, she had oatmeal going bacon starting in the skillet, coffee on the boil. She sliced bread from yesterday's loaf and put it to toast near the stove. The hands came in at 5, 4 men in heavy coats, and they stopped short when they saw the table laid and the food ready. They looked at Eleanor. They looked at the food. One of them, a young man with red hair and an optimistic face, sat down immediately and started filling his plate. "You're the new cook?" another man asked. He was older, gray-haired, with kind eyes and a cautious manner. "Name's Foster. I'm the foreman." "Eleanor Hayes," she said. "How do you take your coffee?" "Strong," said Foster. "Carl there takes it weak. Danny doesn't drink it at all. Jesse will drink anything you put in front of him." "That's fair warning," Eleanor said. The men ate. They didn't talk to her much, but they didn't ignore her either. They were assessing the way working people assess a newcomer, watching how she moved, how she worked, whether she was steady or nervous, whether she'd last, or whether they'd be back to cold mornings in a week. Thomas came in at 5:15 and ate standing at the counter, the way he apparently preferred, and left again without conversation. Eleanor cleared the table and started on the bread she'd planned for the day. She had been at the stove for 20 minutes when she heard something unexpected. Footsteps. Slow ones. Coming down the stairs. Not Thomas's footsteps. She had already learned those heavy and deliberate. These were shuffling, careful, the footsteps of someone who moved like the floor might not be trustworthy. An old man appeared in the kitchen doorway. I was somewhere past 70, thin, in the way of a man who had stopped eating with any real intention. His hair was white and uncombed. He wore a robe over his clothes, which meant he hadn't dressed yet, which meant he hadn't planned to come down today. He stood in the doorway and stared at Eleanor with dark eyes that were still sharp, despite everything else about him that seemed diminished. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I'm the new cook. You must be Mr. Whitaker." "Samuel," he said. "Thomas's father. I live in this house. I wasn't told about you." "I arrived last night," Eleanor said. "Would you like coffee? And breakfast? There's oatmeal still, or I can make eggs if you'd prefer." Samuel stared at her. Then he stared at the stove. His nostrils moved slightly. "What did you cook last night?" he said. "I smelled something. I haven't smelled cooking like that in—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "Ham bone stew," Eleanor said, "with thyme and nutmeg. There's some left if you'd like it for your breakfast." Samuel's jaw tightened. His eyes went sharp, and then very carefully went back to flat. "I'll take eggs," he said. "I don't eat stew for breakfast." "Of course," Eleanor said. He sat down at the table. He waited. Eleanor made his eggs properly, the way she would for anyone she wanted to eat well, and put them in front of him with toast and coffee. She went back to her bread without hovering. Samuel ate everything on the plate. He didn't say thank you, but he also didn't leave until he'd had a second cup of coffee, which Eleanor counted as a positive sign. When he finally stood to go back upstairs, he paused in the doorway. "The nutmeg," he said without turning around. "Margaret put nutmeg in her stew. My wife. She's been gone 11 years. Eleanor kept her hands in the bread dough. "It's a good combination," she said quietly. "The nutmeg adds something you can't quite name, but you notice when it's missing." Samuel didn't respond, but his footsteps on the stairs were slightly less careful than they had been coming down. The first week at Whitaker Ranch taught Eleanor several things. The crew was decent rough in the way of men who spent most of their days outside, but not unkind. Foster kept them in line without being harsh about it, and he treated Eleanor with a respectful neutrality that she appreciated. Jessie, the young red-haired hand, had apparently decided she was the most interesting thing to happen to the ranch in years, and had a tendency to linger in the kitchen, asking unnecessary questions about cooking techniques. Eleanor answered them with patience, because she could see the loneliness underneath the cheerfulness, and recognized it having felt it herself. Thomas was harder to read. He came and went. He worked long hours, came home when the light was gone, ate whatever was left on the stove, and went to bed. He said things to her that were functional. The stovepipe was going to need cleaning before winter. The flour bin could be moved to a better shelf if she needed it. One of the hands was coming down with a cold, and might need something warm kept aside for him. Nothing personal, nothing complicated. But she noticed things. She noticed that he always put his dishes in the sink, never left them on the table. She noticed that he refilled the wood bin on the porch every other day without being asked. She noticed that when Samuel came down for breakfast, which he did every morning. Now something that Foster told her privately had not happened in over a year. Thomas arrived at the table a few minutes later than usual, as though he had heard his father's footsteps and adjusted his timing accordingly, so the old man wouldn't be eating alone. How was a man who noticed things and did things about them and never once said a word about doing them? Eleanor found this both admirable and infuriating. Admirable because it was genuinely good. Infuriating because it left her with nothing to say to him, no way to acknowledge it, no opening. The house was changing though. She had cleaned it top to bottom in the first 3 days, working in the early mornings and late evenings when her other duties were done. She'd rehung a curtain that had come loose in the main room. She'd found a vase in the back of a cabinet and put dried lavender in it on the kitchen table. She'd asked Foster where the ranch grew vegetables and discovered there was a kitchen garden that had gone mostly to weeds. She started pulling them out in her Sunday afternoon hours, slowly reclaiming the beds. She didn't think of it as making herself at home. She thought of it as doing the job. But in the evenings when the kitchen was clean and the stove was banked, and the house had that particular settled-in quality that comes after supper, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table with her mending or her reading, and not entirely wishing she were somewhere else. That was dangerous thinking, and she knew it. She had been at the ranch for 12 days when Richard Cole's name was said in her presence for the first time. She was in the kitchen when she heard it, Foster and Thomas talking on the back porch, their voices low, carrying through the screen door in the particular way that voices carry when the speaker doesn't know anyone is within earshot. "Cole's back," Foster said. A pause. "Back in Willow Creek." Thomas's voice was flat. "Came in on yesterday's stage. Word is, he's been telling people the woman he was going to marry left him. Backed out on the arrangement. Told anyone who'd listen that he had a rough time of it." Another pause. Longer. "That's not what happened," Thomas said. "No," Foster agreed. "It's not. Eleanor stood at the stove with her hand on the pot handle and let this information settle through her. Richard Cole was back. Richard Cole was in Willow Creek telling people she had left him. She took the pot off the heat. She breathed in. She breathed out. She put the pot in the cold water to settle it the way her mother had taught her to stop a sauce from overcooking. Then she started on tomorrow's bread. That evening, Thomas found her at the kitchen table shelling the late beans from the garden. He sat down across from her. This was unusual. He normally sat at the far end of the table or stood at the counter. Eleanor kept shelling beans. "You heard what Foster told me," Thomas said. "I heard it." "You don't have to." He stopped. Tried again. "What Cole's saying in town. People who know anything know that it's not what happened. Garrett told his version when he got back. Most people know." "Most people," Eleanor said. "Enough people," Thomas said. "Willow Creek's small. Truth moves fast when it wants to." Eleanor set down the bean she was working on. "What do people think of me?" she asked. "Not Cole, me. What do they think when they hear about a woman who came west to marry a man she'd never met because she didn't see any other way to start over?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. That at least she respected. He wasn't going to give her comfortable words. "Some of them think it was foolish," he finally said. "And the rest think it took more courage than most people have." Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the table, his jaw set, his hands flat on the wood. "What do you think?" she asked. He looked up. "I think," he said slowly, "that a person who walks into a stranger's house in the rain, asks for a job instead of charity, and makes the best stew I've eaten since my mother was alive, that person is not someone whose judgment I'm worried about." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, just open. She picked up the next bean. "He's going to cause trouble," she said. "Richard Cole. He's not a man who lets things rest." "No," Thomas agreed. "He's not." "He wanted something from me," Eleanor said. "Not me specifically. Something connected to me. I don't know what yet. But a man doesn't construct a lie this quickly about a woman he has no interest in. He wanted something, and whatever it is he thinks he can still get it, or at least damage things enough that I can't settle here." Thomas looked at her steadily. "What kind of something?" "My father's farm," Eleanor said. "He died last spring. There's a small matter of land that isn't quite settled yet back in Ohio. I had a letter from the county clerk about it before I left. I didn't think much of it at the time because I didn't understand the language, but—" She stopped. Because she was looking at Thomas Whitaker's face, and his face had done something very specific. "You know what he wanted," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know Richard Cole. Not well, but enough. He's been buying up land across 3 counties for the past 2 years. Or trying to. Some of it doesn't add up the way it should. There have been questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that get asked when someone promises marriage to several different women in different towns and then disappears before anything is signed." Eleanor stared at him. "Several," she repeated. "You may not be the first," Thomas said. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor set down the beans. "Then he needs to be stopped," she said. Thomas looked at her. Something in his expression was careful measuring, but not the wariness of before. This was different. This was the look of a man figuring out who he was dealing with. "Agreed," he said. He stood. He picked up his hat from the hook near the door. Then he paused. "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She looked up. "Whatever Cole's plan is, he made one serious mistake," Thomas said. "What's that?" He settled the hat on his head and opened the back door. "He left you here," Thomas said. "And now you've had 2 weeks to figure out where everything is." He walked out into the evening. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen with the unshelled beans and the sound of the fire in the stove, and the particular feeling of a person who had arrived believing they had nothing left, and was only now beginning to understand what they had actually found. She picked up the next bean. She thought about Richard Cole, and what he wanted, and what he had set in motion, without understanding what he was setting in motion. She thought about Thomas Whitaker and his mother's nutmeg, and the way he refilled the wood bin without being asked, and the careful, deliberate way he used her given name for the first time only when he had something worth saying. She thought about Samuel upstairs, who had stopped eating until something in the kitchen reminded him why eating mattered. She thought about the kitchen garden slowly coming back. She shelled beans until the lamp burned low, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stage and discovered that the ground beneath her feet was not what she'd expected, for the first time since then, she was not afraid. The beans were still sitting in the bowl on the kitchen table the next morning when Eleanor came downstairs at 4 o'clock. She had left them unfinished the night before, something she never did, because unfinished work had a way of becoming a habit, if you let it. But Thomas's words had stayed with her longer than she'd expected, turning over in her mind in the dark, while she lay in bed listening to the Montana wind work its way around the corners of the house. He left you here, and now you've had 2 weeks to figure out where everything is. She finished the beans while the coffee boiled. Then she put them on to cook for the day's soup and started the biscuits. She was rolling dough when she heard the front door open and close. Not Thomas. He was already out, had been since before she came downstairs. The back porch door had swung shut behind him while it was still fully dark. Not the hands, it was too early even for them. She heard slow, careful footsteps cross the main room. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed, this time fully dressed in proper clothes, his hair combed. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the stove. He looked at the bowl of beans she'd rescued from the table. "You didn't finish them last night," he said. "I was thinking," Eleanor said, "about Cole." She looked up. Samuel met her gaze with those sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. "Thomas told you," she said. "Thomas doesn't tell me anything," Samuel said. He moved to his usual chair and lowered himself into it. "I came downstairs for water last night. I heard enough." He paused. "I knew Cole's father, Harold Cole. 20 years ago, Harold Cole sold 3 men in this valley land that wasn't legally his to sell. One of those men was my neighbor. Lost everything." He watched Eleanor pour his coffee. "The apple doesn't fall far." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "It doesn't seem to." She put his cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it, the way very old people do, drawing the warmth in, as though the cold has gotten into places where warmth is harder to find. "You're not frightened of him," Samuel said. It wasn't admiration exactly, more like an assessment. "I'm frightened of plenty of things," Eleanor said, going back to her biscuits. "I'm frightened of not having enough money to last the winter. I'm frightened of being wrong about people's intentions. I'm frightened of making a decision today that ruins something tomorrow." She pressed the cutter into the dough clean and firm. "But I'm not frightened of Richard Cole specifically. He's a man who works through other people's uncertainty. That only works if you're uncertain." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Margaret said something like that once," he said. "My wife." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She said that most men who try to make a woman feel small are only doing it because they need her to be smaller than them to feel sufficient." Eleanor set down the cutter. She turned and looked at Samuel Whitaker. Really looked at him the way she hadn't quite allowed herself to before, because he had kept such careful distance, and she had respected it. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Eleanor said. "She was ordinary," Samuel said. That was the remarkable thing. She was completely ordinary, and somehow everything made more sense when she was in the room. His voice didn't waver, but he looked at his coffee. "Thomas is like her in that way. Won't tell you that, of course. He doesn't say much of anything." "I've noticed," Eleanor said. Something shifted at the corner of Samuel's mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. The hands came in at 5. Thomas appeared at 5:15, sat at the counter with his coffee and his biscuit, and looked at his father sitting at the table with Eleanor's newspaper. She'd bought it in Willow Creek the week before, and it had been passed around the house 3 times already, and something moved in Thomas's face. Something quiet and careful before he looked away. Eleanor saw it. She said nothing. She was getting better at that. It was Foster who first told her what people in town were saying. He came back from the supply run on Thursday with flour lamp oil, a bag of salt, and the kind of careful expression that meant he had information he wasn't sure how to deliver. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when he found her. She had cleared half the far bed and was working on the second half, pulling weeds out by the root, the way her mother had taught her, firm and thorough, because a half-pulled weed just grows back meaner. Foster stood at the garden gate. He held his hat. "You might want to hear this before Thomas gets back," he said. Eleanor sat back on her heels. "Say it straight, Foster. I'd rather know. Cole's been in the saloon most nights since he got back, telling anyone who'll listen that you came out here under false pretenses, that you misrepresented yourself in your letters to him, that you led him to believe you had property and money that you didn't have." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "And what do people say?" "Mixed," Foster admitted. "The ones who know Garrett's account know Cole's version is missing some pieces. But Cole's been buying drinks for people, and a man who buys you a drink gets to talk for a while without interruption." He paused. "He's also been saying something else. Something about your father's land in Ohio. He's saying there's a dispute over the deed, and that you have no legal claim to it, and that you knew that before you came west." Eleanor went very still. "What does he know about my father's land?" she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "That's the part I couldn't figure out," Foster said. "He knew the county name. He knew the acreage. He knew your father's name. That's not the kind of detail a man pulls from air." Eleanor stood up slowly. She brushed the dirt off her hands. "He got my letters," she said, "before I came west. I wrote to him about where I was from, about the farm. I thought it was normal you write to a man you're planning to marry, you tell him about your life." She shook her head. "I didn't think he was documenting it." "For what purpose?" Foster asked. "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. "But whatever he thinks that land is worth, he thinks it's worth enough to travel across the territory, build a lie, and keep building it." She picked up her garden tools. She walked toward the house. At the back door she stopped. "Foster," she said without turning around. "When Thomas gets back, will you tell him I need to speak with him this evening, not urgently, after supper?" "I'll tell him," Foster said. Eleanor went inside and started on supper. She cooked the way she always did, when something was bothering her thoroughly, more thoroughly than was strictly necessary, because cooking required her hands and part of her mind, and left the rest free to think without running away with itself. She made roast chicken with root vegetables. She made a second loaf of bread because the first one was nearly gone. She made a pudding with the last of the dried apples. Because Samuel had mentioned once in passing that Margaret made apple pudding in the fall, and Eleanor had filed that away without examining why she'd filed it. By the time supper was on the table, she had thought through most of what she needed to think through. The crew ate well and went to the bunkhouse. Samuel ate his pudding with more visible satisfaction than he would probably have admitted, then went upstairs. Eleanor cleared the table and washed the dishes and waited. Thomas came in from the barn at 7:30. He looked at the clean kitchen, at Eleanor, sitting at the table with the letter in her hand, the one from the county clerk in Ohio, the one she'd been carrying at the bottom of her carpet bag since July. He sat down across from her. She slid the letter across the table. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. "When did you receive this?" he asked. 3 weeks before I left Ohio," Eleanor said. "I didn't understand most of the legal language. I knew there was something about the deed not being settled, something about a prior claim. But my father's lawyer wrote back and said it was a routine matter and would be resolved without my involvement." She paused. "I think now that perhaps my father's lawyer was not entirely my father's lawyer." Thomas looked at her. "You think Cole had access to the lawyer," he said. "I think someone did. Someone who knew the situation before I arrived in Willow Creek. Someone who knew about the land before I did." She folded her hands on the table. "Richard Cole didn't come to Willow Creek to marry me, Thomas. He came to establish a connection to my father's property through me. Marriage would have given him a legal avenue to file a claim. When I arrived, and there was nothing immediate to gain, maybe he realized the deed dispute was more complicated than he'd been told, or maybe he'd already gotten what he needed from the lawyer and didn't need me anymore. He left." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "What's the land worth?" he asked. "My father's farm is 40 acres. Good farmland, not spectacular. but it sits adjacent to a larger tract that a railroad company has been buying up. She paused. A rail line through that corridor would make the 40 acres worth significantly more than 40 acres of good farmland. The kitchen was very quiet. "Who else knows this?" Thomas asked. "No one here," Eleanor said. "I didn't know the significance of it myself until tonight, honestly. I was putting the pieces together while I was cooking." Thomas looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Eleanor. "This is not a small thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "Cole is not just embarrassing you in town. He's working on something larger. If he's established himself back in Willow Creek, if he's building a public story about your credibility, he's laying groundwork," Eleanor said. "If my character is in question, anything I say about the land dispute becomes less credible. If I'm known as the woman who misrepresented herself and came west under false pretenses, I can't stand up in front of a lawyer or a judge and make a coherent claim." "He's not just after your land," Thomas said slowly. "He's after your voice. He wants to take away your ability to be believed." The words landed in the room and sat there. Eleanor had known this somewhere underneath the surface since Foster told her what Cole was saying in the saloon. But hearing it said plainly in Thomas Whitaker's deliberate, careful voice made it real in a way that her own silent knowing hadn't quite managed. "Yes," she said. Thomas stood. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see him thinking the way she'd learned to recognize the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were very still. "I know a lawyer in Billings," he said. "Robert Marsh. He's honest and he's good, which are not always the same thing. I'll write to him tomorrow." Eleanor looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Thomas said. He turned around. "Cole tried to use you to get at something. He's now using lies about you to protect his position. That's happening in my town, with a woman who works at my ranch, and I'm not going to sit in my kitchen drinking coffee while it continues." His jaw was set. "I'll write to Marsh tomorrow." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Thomas said. "We don't know how deep this goes." He picked up the letter and took it with him when he left. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen and listened to the house settle around her in the way that old houses do. When the temperature drops, small creaks and adjustments, the timber breathing. She thought about what Thomas had said. He wants to take away your ability to be believed. She thought about how long she had spent in her life, being careful not to ask for too much, not to take up too much space, not to want things too loudly. She had been quiet and capable, and had made herself useful, and had still in the end been discarded by a man who had never seen her as anything other than a means to something else. She was done being careful in that particular way. She got up, banked the stove, and went to bed. 3 days later, Jesse came running back from town with his face flushed and his breath short, and the news changed everything. Eleanor was pulling bread from the oven when he burst through the back door and she nearly dropped the pan. "Cole's been talking to somebody," Jesse said, bracing his hands on his knees. "Stranger came in on the noon stage, came straight to the saloon, spent 2 hours with Cole, left again on horseback heading east." Eleanor set the bread on the cooling rack. "Did anyone hear what they discussed?" "Martha at the post office heard some of it through the wall. She said the stranger was asking about land deeds, specifically about deeds in Ohio transferred within the last 2 years, and he had papers with him, legal-looking papers." Eleanor turned to look at Jesse fully. "What did Cole tell him?" "That's the thing," Jesse said. "Martha said Cole looked nervous, which nobody's ever seen before, apparently. Cole's always comfortable. But whoever this man was, Cole wasn't comfortable around him." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jesse, go find Foster. Tell him I need to speak with him before Thomas gets back this evening." Jesse was out the door before she finished the sentence. Foster came in 20 minutes later. Eleanor poured him coffee and set it on the table and sat across from him and said, "I need to understand something about land law in this territory. How a claim gets challenged. What happens if there's a prior deed that someone is trying to suppress? What legal standing a woman has on her own in a county proceeding." Foster looked at her for a long moment. "You're planning something," he said. I'm preparing, Eleanor said. There's a difference. Is there? She met his gaze. A plan assumes I know what Cole is going to do. I don't. Preparation means I know what I'm going to do, regardless of what he does. Foster drank his coffee. He was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked for an hour. Foster had spent years in territorial law before an injury ended his writing career, and he'd come to work for Thomas and Eleanor. Listened to every word with the attention she gave to a recipe she intended to make perfectly, completely without gaps, because gaps in a recipe were where things went wrong. By the time Thomas came home, Eleanor knew 3 things she hadn't known that morning. First, a deed dispute in Ohio could affect legal proceedings in Montana if the properties were connected through a railroad land corridor, which they were. Second, a woman could file an independent legal statement with the county clerk in Willow Creek, establishing her account of events, and that statement would be dated and witnessed and could not be altered after filing. Third, the stranger who had visited Cole was almost certainly a land agent, and land agents didn't visit men who were winning. They visited men whose positions were getting complicated. Thomas came home to find Eleanor Foster and Samuel all at the kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at his father, who had not sat at that table in the company of other people voluntarily in over a year. He looked at Foster, who had the expression of a man who had just finished sharing information he'd been carrying alone for too long. He looked at Eleanor, who had her hands folded on the table and was watching him with calm, clear eyes. "What happened?" Thomas said. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "I'll tell you everything, and then I need to ask you a question." Thomas sat down. Eleanor told him about the land agent, about the legal avenue Foster had described, about the statement she intended to file. She told him concisely and without drama, because drama wasn't what this required. When she finished, Thomas looked at Foster. "You think she's right about the land agent?" he asked. "I think it's the only explanation that makes sense," Foster said. "Cole's been operating on the assumption that Eleanor has no legal ground to stand on here and no one to help her find any. The agent showing up means someone in Ohio is paying attention. That's either good news or very bad news." "Which do you think?" Thomas asked. "I think it depends on who hired him," Foster said. "If it's the railroad, it could go either way. If it's the county clerk's office, it's good. If it's someone on Cole's side," he shrugged. "Then we have a bigger problem than we thought." Thomas turned to Eleanor. "The question you wanted to ask me," he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I want to go to Willow Creek tomorrow, to the county clerk's office, to file my statement. I want to do it in person publicly in the morning when people are moving around town and can see me do it." She paused. "I want people to see that I'm not hiding, and I'm not afraid, and I'm not the woman Cole has been describing." Thomas said nothing. "I'm not asking for your protection," Eleanor said. "I'm asking if you'll come with me, as a witness to the filing. Because your name in this county means something, and I won't pretend it doesn't. And using the resources available to you is not the same as being dependent on them." The kitchen was very quiet. Samuel cleared his throat. "The girl makes sense," he said. He said it to his coffee cup as though addressing it directly, but he said it loudly enough for the room. Thomas looked at his father. Something passed between them. Something that belonged to their history, to 11 years of a house that had been running on grief and good intentions and not much else. Then he looked at Eleanor. "5 o'clock start," he said. "If we leave before the crew is up, we'll make Willow Creek by 8, and the clerk's office opens at 8:30. "I'll have breakfast ready at 4:30, Eleanor said. Thomas nodded. He stood. He started for the back door. Then he stopped. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "What you said earlier, about using the resources available not being the same as being dependent on them." He paused. "That's a fine distinction. Most people don't make it." He went out. Samuel looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. "He's not good at saying things," the old man said. "He is good at meaning them." "I know," Eleanor said. She stood and started clearing the table. She was moving with the particular steadiness of a person who has found the thing she was looking for, even if she couldn't quite name it yet. The house felt different tonight. Not bigger or brighter or warmer in any physical sense. just occupied, like a house that had remembered what it was for. Samuel pushed back his chair to stand. "Apple pudding again tomorrow?" he asked. The corner of Eleanor's mouth lifted. "I'll see what we have," she said. Samuel made a small sound of approval and went upstairs. Eleanor washed the cups in the quiet kitchen, listening to the fire settle, and thought about tomorrow. About the county clerk's office, and the statement she would file, and what it would mean to walk into that building and say clearly, and on the record, exactly what had happened to her, and what she intended to do about it. She thought about Richard Cole in the saloon, nervous for the first time, and what that nervousness meant. She thought about Thomas Whitaker driving a wagon into town at 8 o'clock in the morning with the deliberate, visible intention of standing beside her when she did it. She thought about Samuel Whitaker asking for apple pudding. Then she dried her hands, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs to write the statement she would file in the morning. She wrote it by candlelight. She wrote it plainly and completely, without anger and without apology, because both of those things would weaken it. She wrote the facts in the order they had happened. She wrote her father's name and the farm's location, and the nature of the correspondence with Richard Cole, and the promises made and broken, and what she knew now about the land dispute that she had not known when she arrived. She wrote for an hour and 20 minutes. When she was done, she read it back once. She changed 2 words. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She blew out the candle. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and cold, and completely indifferent to the small, specific, hard-won courage of a woman sitting in an upstairs room, deciding she would not be quiet about what had been done to her. Eleanor Hayes went to sleep. Tomorrow, she would go to town. They left before the sun came up. Eleanor was on the wagon seat beside Thomas by 4:55, her statement folded inside her coat pocket, her hands steady in her lap. The morning was cold enough to see breath. Neither of them spoke for the first mile, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind between people who have already said the important things and don't need to fill the space around them with noise. It was Thomas who broke it. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," Eleanor said. "Did you some?" he said. That was the end of that conversation, and somehow it was enough. The road into Willow Creek took them past 3 other ranch properties, the Hendersons, the old Briggs place that had been empty 2 seasons now, and the narrow strip of grazing land that bordered the creek itself. Eleanor had learned the geography of the valley in pieces over the past weeks. The way she learned most things, by paying attention to what people said and didn't say, what they pointed to, and what they looked away from. She was paying attention now. "The Briggs land," she said as they passed the empty property. "Who owns it since Briggs left?" Thomas's jaw tightened slightly, just slightly. "Currently under dispute," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Cole," she said. "Cole filed a claim 6 months ago," Thomas said. "Briggs left owing a debt to the Willow Creek Bank. Cole bought the debt. Whether buying the debt gives him the right to file on the land is what's being disputed." "And the bank's position?" "The bank is run by a man named Aldridge," Thomas said. "Aldridge and Cole have dinner together twice a month." Eleanor turned this over in her mind. "So Cole has the bank," she said. "And whatever he's building toward, he's been building it here in this valley for a while. I wasn't the only approach. I was one approach. One of several," Thomas confirmed. "The Briggs land. The Henderson acreage Ed Henderson took out a loan last spring that he's having difficulty servicing. 2 other smaller properties east of town with unclear deed histories." He paused. "And whatever he was trying to establish through you and your father's land in Ohio." Eleanor thought about the railroad corridor. About 40 acres that sat in exactly the right place. "If he controls enough of the valley land," she said slowly, "and if the railroad comes through, he'd be the wealthiest man in 3 counties, Thomas said, without doing a day's honest work to earn it." The wagon rolled on. Willow Creek appeared in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the town waking up to its ordinary morning, while something that was very much not ordinary moved toward it on a wagon driven by a rancher who had decided that enough was enough. Eleanor straightened her spine. She was ready. The county clerk's office opened at 8:30 precisely, which Eleanor appreciated. She liked people who kept to their stated time. The clerk was a small, precise man named Herbert Mays, who wore wire spectacles and handled documents the way a person handles things they genuinely respect. He looked at Eleanor when she came in, looked at Thomas behind her, and then looked at the folded papers she placed on his counter. "I'd like to file a formal statement," Eleanor said, "regarding a misrepresentation made against my character by a man named Richard Cole, currently residing in Willow Creek, and regarding the status of a property deed in Franklin County, Ohio, that I believe is being unlawfully manipulated." Herbert Mays looked at the papers. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Eleanor. "Do you understand that a filed statement becomes part of the public record?" he said. "That's precisely why I'm filing it," Eleanor said. Mays took the papers. He read them, all of them, carefully, with the spectacles pushed up close, while Eleanor and Thomas stood on the other side of the counter and waited. Thomas stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes forward, and his presence in that small office was large and deliberate and entirely intentional, and Eleanor felt it like something solid at her back. When Mays finished reading, he looked up. "This is a serious set of allegations," he said. "They are accurate allegations," Eleanor said. "I have correspondence to support each one. I'll provide copies." Mays looked at Thomas. "Mr. Whitaker." "She's telling the truth," Thomas said, simply, without elaboration, because he understood that elaboration would weaken it. Mays stamped the document. He dated it. He signed it. He gave Eleanor her copy. "Filed," he said. 8:42 October 14th, 1884. Eleanor folded her copy and put it in her coat pocket beside the original. "Thank you, Mr. Mays," she said. She turned and walked out of the office into the morning air, and Thomas followed her, and for a moment they both stood on the wooden sidewalk outside and let it settle. "That's done," Thomas said. "That part is done," Eleanor said. She was looking across the street. At the saloon, which wouldn't open for another 2 hours, but whose existence was present in the town, the way certain things are not visible, but felt. "He'll hear about this by noon," she said. "He'll hear about it by 10, Thomas said. "Mays has a wife who talks." "Good," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her sideways. "You want him to know," he said. "I want him to have to decide what to do next," Eleanor said. "A man who's been operating in the dark doesn't do well when someone turns on a light. He either runs or he makes a mistake." She looked at Thomas. "Either outcome works for us." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular economy of a man who didn't compliment people carelessly, he said, "You think clearly under pressure." "I've had practice," Eleanor said. They went to get coffee at the diner before heading back. Gachag. Martha at the post office got the news to the saloon by 9:45, which was even faster than Thomas had predicted. Eleanor knew this because by the time she and Thomas were halfway through their coffee at the diner, the door opened and a man she had never seen before walked in, looked directly at her, and sat down at the counter 3 stools away. He ordered coffee. He didn't look at her again. But he didn't need to. The looking had already happened. "Land agent," Thomas said quietly, without moving his eyes from his cup. "The one from the stage," Eleanor said, equally quiet. "Yes." They finished their coffee at a normal pace. Thomas paid. They walked out. On the wagon heading east back toward the ranch, Eleanor said, "He was assessing me." "Yes." "Which means Cole sent him." "Or whoever sent Cole sent him," Thomas said. "Cole may be the visible part of something bigger." This was a thought Eleanor had been working toward herself, but hadn't quite let herself complete. She completed it now. "The lawyer in Ohio," she said. "The one my father thought was his. If someone had access to that lawyer, not just Cole, but whoever is behind Cole, they would have known about the railroad corridor before Cole approached me. They would have been planning this for over a year." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we need Marsh," he said. "The lawyer in Billings. I wrote to him 2 days ago. I'll send a follow-up today by telegraph." Eleanor nodded. She rode the rest of the way home, thinking about invisible structures, the way some things only made sense once you could see the whole shape of them, and how the whole shape only became visible when you forced it into the light. She had forced the first piece into the light this morning. Now she had to wait and see what else the light found. What it found was worse than she'd expected, and faster. 2 days after the filing, Foster came back from a supply run with his face carefully neutral, in the way that meant the news was bad enough that he'd practiced the telling on the road home. He found Eleanor and Thomas both in the kitchen. Thomas had taken to coming in for coffee in the mid-morning, something he hadn't done before, something Eleanor had noticed without commenting on, and he sat down and put his hands on the table. "There's a man from the Billings land office in town," Foster said. "He arrived yesterday evening. Name of Greer. He's been with Cole since this morning." Thomas went very still. "Greer," he said. The name meant something to him. Eleanor could see it. "You know him," she said. "I know of him," Thomas said. "He handled the Briggs debt claim for Cole. He's not a government man. He's a private land agent who does filing work for people who want paperwork done without asking too many questions." He looked at Foster. "What are they doing?" "According to what Martha heard through the post office wall, and I know that's a thin source, but it's what we have, Greer brought a document from Ohio, from a court in Franklin County, an injunction." Eleanor put down her coffee cup. "An injunction on what?" she said. Foster looked at her directly, because he was a decent man, and decent men look at you when they say hard things. "On the transfer of any property or assets associated with your father's estate," he said, "filed on the grounds that the estate's disposition is under active legal dispute, and that you, as a potential beneficiary, are a party to that dispute, and therefore cannot take any actions that might affect the estate's value." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not right," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "That's not what an injunction of that kind means. You can't apply a property injunction to a person's employment or residence. That's not what that instrument is for." "No," Foster agreed. "It's not." But Greer's argument, which he made loudly enough at the saloon last night for half the town to hear, is that your presence at Whitaker Ranch constitutes a financial arrangement that has affected the ranch's value specifically by your involvement in the garden and household improvements, and that those improvements are potentially subject to the estate dispute because they were made by you. Silence. Thomas stood up. He stood very slowly, the way a man stands when he is working very hard, not to act on the first thing he feels. "He's saying," Thomas said, "that Eleanor's work on this ranch is the ranch's property, and that because her work is tied to a disputed estate, the ranch itself is potentially involved in the dispute." "That's what he's saying," Foster said. "That's the most dishonest legal argument I have ever heard in my life," Thomas said. "It doesn't have to be correct," Eleanor said quietly. "It just has to be filed. Once it's filed, it creates questions. Questions slow things down. Slowing things down gives Cole time to complete whatever else he's working on." Thomas looked at her. She looked back at him. "He's not attacking the land anymore," she said. "He's attacking me here. He's trying to make me a liability to you, to the ranch. If staying here costs you something legally, financially, reputationally, then the pressure moves from me to you, and you become the one who has to make a decision about whether I stay." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had heard in weeks. Thomas said very quietly, "He doesn't know me very well." "No," Eleanor said. "He doesn't." "Eleanor." He said her name the way he always did when he meant something precisely. "Are you listening to me?" "Yes," she said. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Not because of Cole, not because of Greer, not because of an injunction that wouldn't survive 3 minutes in front of a real judge. You are not going anywhere." It was the most words Thomas Whitaker had said in sequence on a personal matter since Eleanor had arrived, and the kitchen felt them. Foster found something extremely interesting to look at on the table. Eleanor held Thomas's gaze for a moment. "Then we need Marsh here," she said. "Not a letter, not a telegraph. Here, in Willow Creek, before Cole and Greer do anything else." "I'll ride to Billings myself if I have to," Thomas said. "Send Jesse," Eleanor said. "He's fast and he's motivated. Tell him what's at stake. He'll make good time." Thomas looked at Foster. Foster looked at Thomas. "She's right," Foster said. "Jesse'll make Billings in a day and a half if the weather holds." "Send him," Thomas said. Foster was out the door in 2 minutes. Eleanor heard him calling for Jessie across the yard. She turned back to the stove and picked up the pot she'd set down when Foster came in. Her hands were steady. She noticed that they were steady and thought that steadiness was a choice more than a feeling. You chose it the way you chose what to cook when you were frightened, not because you weren't frightened, but because the work still needed doing. Eleanor, Thomas said behind her. She didn't turn around. He's not going to win, Thomas said. I want you to know that. Whatever he files, whatever argument Greer makes, whatever story Cole tells in that saloon, he's not going to win. Eleanor set the pot down. She turned around. I know, she said. But I want to be the one who stops him. Not you, not Marsh, not the law acting on my behalf. I want to stand up in front of this town and tell them what he did. Myself. In my own words. She paused. Can you give me that? Thomas looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said. Jesse left for Billings that afternoon. He went fast the way young men go when they understand that speed matters and someone is counting on them. Eleanor watched him ride out and felt something she hadn't expected, gratitude that was almost painful. The kind you feel when people you haven't known long do things you didn't know you could ask for. The next 3 days were tense in the particular way of waiting, not empty, but stretched. Eleanor cooked. She tended the garden. She went over her correspondence with Foster, organizing everything she had into an order that a lawyer could use. She wrote a second statement longer and more detailed than the first, covering everything she had learned since filing the land agent. The injunction, the connections she had mapped between Cole and Aldridge at the bank and the lawyer in Ohio. Samuel came to the kitchen every morning and ate his breakfast, and sometimes sat for an hour after reading or simply being present in the way that very old people sometimes are, as though sitting in a warm room with someone steady nearby is itself a kind of medicine. On the second day he brought something down from upstairs. He set it on the kitchen table while Eleanor was working on the bread. It was a leather folder, old and worn at the corners, stuffed with papers. Margaret kept records, he said, of everything the ranch did, every transaction, every debt, every payment, every dealing with every bank and merchant and land office in the county going back 30 years. He sat down. Thomas doesn't know I still have these. He thinks I threw them out after she died. Eleanor looked at the folder. Why are you telling me? She said. Because Richard Cole's father tried to buy this ranch from me 22 years ago, Samuel said. And I have every letter he wrote, and every document he filed, and every false claim he made right here in this folder. He put his hand flat on it. And if the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, then some of what Harold Cole did 20 years ago might look very familiar to a lawyer trying to understand what Richard Cole is doing now. Eleanor stared at him. Samuel, she said. Don't make a fuss about it, he said. Just use it. She crossed the kitchen. She sat down across from him. She opened the folder. They worked through it together, Samuel and Eleanor, for the better part of 2 days, him explaining, her organizing. Both of them, finding the shape of something that had been operating in this valley for 2 decades, a pattern of manufactured debt and false claims and strategic marriages that Harold Cole had used, and that his son had apparently studied well. It was methodical work, patient work, the kind that doesn't feel dramatic while you're doing it, but that builds towards something that is. On the evening of the 3rd day, Thomas came in and found them both at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. He stopped. He looked at the papers. He looked at his father. He looked at Eleanor. What is all this? He said. Your mother was an excellent record keeper, Eleanor said. Your grandfather was apparently a very thorough man when it came to defending what was his. Thomas crossed the room. He looked at the papers. He picked up one of the letters, one of Harold Cole's letters, 22 years old, the handwriting sharp and confident and full of language that looked legal but wasn't. His jaw tightened. He tried this before, Thomas said. His father did, Eleanor said, with your grandfather, and with at least 2 other families in this valley based on what Samuel remembers. She paused. Richard Cole didn't invent this. He inherited it, which means there may be a pattern going back far enough and involving enough people that a territorial court would have to take notice. Thomas set the letter down. He looked at his father. Samuel looked back at him without apology or sentiment. "You should have told me about these," Thomas said. "I'm telling you now," Samuel said. Something passed between them, the complicated thing that passes between fathers and sons who have spent years not saying what needed saying. It didn't resolve in that moment. These things don't. But it moved. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down. "Show me everything," he said. Jesse came back from Billings on the morning of the fourth day, and he didn't come back alone. Robert Marsh was a tall man in his 50s, with a weathered face and the particular stillness of someone who had sat in enough courtrooms to know that the person who moves first usually loses. He came into the Whitaker kitchen, accepted coffee, and read every document Eleanor and Samuel had assembled without saying a single word for 45 minutes. When he finished, he looked up. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I'm going to ask you to tell me everything, from the beginning, in whatever order makes sense to you. Don't skip anything because you think it's small." Eleanor told him everything. She told it the way she'd been telling it to herself in the quiet hours, clearly chronologically, without anger and without apology, because Marsh was not a man who needed her to be emotional, and he was not a man who needed her to be small. When she finished, Marsh looked at Thomas. "The injunction Greer filed is fraudulent," Marsh said. "Not legally questionable fraudulent. Applying an estate injunction to an employment arrangement is not a gray area. It's either ignorance or a deliberate misuse of a legal instrument, and Greer isn't ignorant." He tapped the stack of papers from Samuel's folder. "The pattern here is significant. I have contacts in Columbus who have been looking at deed irregularities in Franklin County for the past 8 months. What you've described connects to something larger than one man in one valley." He paused. "I need to send some telegraphs. And then I think it's time someone spoke to Richard Cole directly." "I'll go," Thomas said. "No," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She looked at Thomas first, steadily, without flinching. "I told you I wanted to be the one to stop him," she said. "I meant it. Not someone speaking on my behalf. Me." Thomas held her gaze. His jaw worked. "Eleanor, I know what I'm doing," she said. "I've known what I'm doing since the night you told me he wanted to take away my ability to be believed." She looked at Marsh. "Can you arrange a meeting? Something public enough that what gets said can't be denied afterward." Marsh looked at her for a long moment, with the assessing eyes of a man who had seen many people in difficult positions and had learned to tell the difference between bravado and actual readiness. "There's a town meeting scheduled for Saturday," he said. "Monthly. Most of Willow Creek attends. The agenda is routine, but agenda items can be added." "Add one," Eleanor said. Marsh looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Eleanor. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Thomas said, "Do it." And Eleanor felt the decision settle through her, like something finding its place after a long time of being carried in the wrong position. A kind of relief that was also a kind of readiness. The feeling of a person who has finally stopped moving away from the thing they were always going to have to face. She stood up. She started clearing the coffee cups. "I'll need to write one more statement," she said. "This one for the public record." She looked at Marsh. "I'd like your help with the legal language." "That's what I'm here for," Marsh said. Samuel, who had been quiet through all of it, reached out and put his hand briefly on Eleanor's arm as she passed him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Eleanor went to get her pen. Eleanor wrote through most of Thursday night. Marsh sat across from her at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, going over every word, not to soften it. He was clear about that from the beginning, but to make it precise. Precision, he told her, was the thing that made a statement unassailable. Emotion could be dismissed. Precision could not. She took that seriously. She crossed out 3 sentences that were accurate but imprecise. She rewrote 2 others that were precise but incomplete. She added a section she hadn't planned to add about Harold Cole's dealings 20 years earlier and the documented pattern in Samuel's folder, because Marsh said the pattern was the most legally significant element and it needed to be stated plainly, not implied. By the time they finished, it was 12 pages. 12 pages of the clearest, most carefully constructed account of her own life that Eleanor had ever put on paper. Marsh read the final version straight through. "This is good," he said. He said it the way a man says something is good when he means it without reservation. This is very good. Will it be enough? Eleanor asked. In front of the right people, yes, Marsh said. The question is whether Saturday's meeting puts it in front of the right people. He paused. Cole will be there. He's too arrogant to stay away. I know, Eleanor said. That's why I want it to be Saturday. Marsh studied her face. You're not doing this to humiliate him. No, Eleanor said. I'm doing this because the people in that room have been living in the same valley as him for years, and some of them have already been hurt by him or his father, and some of them are going to be hurt by him if nobody stops him. They deserve to know what they're dealing with. She looked at the finished statement on the table. And I deserve to be the one who tells them. Marsh nodded slowly. Saturday, he said. He gathered his papers and went to the room Thomas had prepared for him. Eleanor banked the stove and went upstairs. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and ran through the statement in her mind, not anxiously, but the way a musician runs through a piece before a performance, not because they've forgotten it, but because they want to know that it lives in them, not just on the page. It lived in her. She slept. Friday arrived with the particular tension of a day before something important, where ordinary things feel slightly unreal because your mind is already living in tomorrow. Eleanor made breakfast. The crew ate. Thomas came in at 5:15 and sat at the counter and was quieter than usual, which she hadn't thought was possible. After the hands went out, he stayed. Eleanor poured herself coffee and sat at the table. Thomas remained at the counter with his cup. The kitchen was quiet around them. Are you going to tell me not to do it? Eleanor said. No, Thomas said. Are you going to tell me to be careful? Would it change anything? No, she said. Then I won't waste the words, he said. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the counter the way he did when he was working through something he hadn't resolved yet. What then? She said. He looked up. I want you to know, he said carefully, in the way he said everything that mattered, that whatever happens in that room on Saturday, whatever Cole says, whatever Greer tries, whatever the town thinks, before you've had your chance to speak, it doesn't change anything here. He paused. You have a place at this ranch. That's not conditional. Eleanor held his gaze. Thomas, she said quietly. When I came to this ranch, I had 14 cents and a letter from a county clerk, and no idea what I was walking into. She looked at her coffee cup, then back at him. I am not going to be reckless with what I've found here. I promise you that. Something in Thomas Whitaker's face did something careful and difficult and honest. I know, he said. He finished his coffee and went out to the day's work. Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table for a moment and breathed. Then she stood up and started on the day's bread, because bread required attention, and right now she needed something that required all of it. Samuel came downstairs at 7, dressed and combed, and sat at the table. He did not ask for coffee immediately, which meant he had something to say. Eleanor waited. I want to come on Saturday, he said. She turned from the stove. Samuel, I am 73 years old, and I am not an invalid, Samuel said. I've been sitting in that room upstairs for 11 months. I came down for breakfast, and I'm glad I did. I'm not going to sit in that room while something important happens in the town where my family has lived for 30 years. He looked at her directly. Harold Cole tried to take something from my father. His son tried to take something from you. I want to be in that room. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then you'll come, she said. Samuel nodded. He reached for the coffee pot. The apple pudding was better last week, he said. You used more cinnamon. I'll use more cinnamon, Eleanor said. Saturday morning came cold and clear, the kind of Montana October morning that felt like the sky had been scrubbed overnight and left to dry. Thomas drove. Eleanor sat beside him. Samuel sat in the back, wrapped in a heavy coat and a blanket across his knees, and when Jesse offered to help him up onto the wagon, Samuel looked at him with such specific displeasure that Jesse stepped back immediately and pretended to be very interested in the horse's bridle. Foster came. So did Jesse and two of the other hands, Carl and Danny, who had not been asked but had apparently made their own decision about where to be. They arrived in Willow Creek at 9, which gave Eleanor an hour before the meeting started. She spent it with Marsh going over the order of presentation one final time. Marsh had his own documents telegraphs that had come back from Columbus overnight, 3 of them, and one from the Federal Land Office in Helena that made his normally composed face do something sharp and satisfied when he read it. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "The Columbus contacts," Marsh said. "They've been building a case on irregular deed transfers in Franklin County for 8 months. Your father's property is on their list. They were already watching the lawyer. Your father used a man named Pritchard. Pritchard has now been suspended from practice pending investigation." He paused. "And the Federal Land Office in Helena received a complaint last month about Richard Cole's Briggs land claim. They've opened a review." Eleanor stared at him. "Someone else was already moving against him," she said. "Multiple someones," Marsh said. "What you've done by filing your statement and bringing these documents from Samuel is connect the pieces. You've given them a center." He folded the telegraphs carefully. "Cole didn't just make enemies in this valley. He made them in Ohio and in Helena. He made them in a federal land office that does not enjoy being told that its instruments have been used fraudulently. He's been operating too broadly," Eleanor said. "He spread himself across too many counties, too many states. He thought no one would connect it." "He thought no one would connect it because he was careful about the people he targeted," Marsh said. "Women, people without legal resources, people who didn't know each other." He looked at Eleanor directly. He didn't count on one of them being stubborn enough to stay. Eleanor picked up her copy of the statement. "Let's go in," she said. The meeting hall was 3/4 full by 9:50, which was unusual for a monthly town gathering where the agenda was typically boundary disputes and road maintenance. Word had gotten around. In a town the size of Willow Creek, word always got around. Eleanor walked in without rushing. She sat in the 3rd row with Thomas on her left and Marsh on her right, and Samuel, who had walked in under his own power, without accepting anyone's arm, to the visible surprise of several people who recognized him one seat down from Thomas. Foster and the Hands took the row behind them. Richard Cole was in the back right corner. He was dressed well as he always was, and he had Greer beside him, and he watched Eleanor walk in with the particular kind of watchful stillness of a man running rapid calculations. Eleanor did not look at him. She looked at the room. She looked at the faces the storekeeper who had told her Cole was gone on the morning she arrived, the diner woman who had offered her soup and sympathy, Martha from the post office, Ed Henderson, whose loan from Aldridge's bank was running him into the ground. 3 or 4 other ranch families she recognized from deliveries and supply runs. The bank manager Aldridge himself in the front row, looking like a man who had been told there might be weather and was now watching the clouds with increasing concern. The meeting was called to order by the mayor, a broad-shouldered man named Carver, who ran the feed store and had the natural authority of someone people simply tended to listen to. He ran through the standard items: road grading east of town, the date for the fall harvest celebration, a water rights question between 2 properties on the north side. Normal. Ordinary. The town doing its regular business. Then he said, "There's one additional item added to the agenda this month. Miss Eleanor Hayes has requested time to address the town. I'll give her the floor." The room shifted. The particular shift of a room that has been waiting for something and now knows it's about to happen. Eleanor stood. She walked to the front without hurrying. She turned and faced the room. She did not look at Cole. Not yet. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said. "Most of you know who I am by now, or think you do. I'd like to give you the accurate version." She told it the way she'd told it to Marsh, clearly, completely, without anger, and without performance. She told them about the letters, about the promises, about arriving to find Cole gone, about 14 cents and a stranger named Garrett, and a ranch that smelled like cold and grief, and a stew she'd made from ham bone and thyme and nutmeg. She told them about the land, about her father's 40 acres and the railroad corridor, and what that combination was worth to someone who knew how to use it. She told them about the injunction and what it actually said, versus what Greer had claimed it said in this very saloon 3 nights ago. She told them about Harold Cole, and she watched several older faces in the room change as she did. Recognition, anger, the particular expression of people remembering something they had hoped to forget. She told them about the Columbus investigation and the suspended lawyer and the Federal Land Office review in Helena. And then she stopped. The room was completely quiet. "I'm not here to ask you to feel sorry for me," Eleanor said. "I made a decision to come west, and that decision was mine. What Richard Cole did was not something I invited and not something I deserved, but that's not why I'm standing here." She looked around the room at Henderson, at the storekeeper, at the families in the middle rows who had been living next door to something without knowing it. "I'm standing here because I am not the first person in this valley that this family has done this to. And I am not going to be the one who stays quiet and lets there be another." She sat down. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Carver said, "Mr. Cole, I imagine you'd like to respond." Cole stood. He was smooth, she had to give him that. He straightened his jacket and took a breath and composed his face into something that looked like patient dignity. The face of a man being accused of things he found both false and tiresome. "Miss Hayes," he said, addressing the room, rather than her, "came to Willow Creek under a misunderstanding." "No," Eleanor said. She said it clearly, not loudly. She didn't stand up. She said it from her seat, one word, and it stopped him entirely. "You didn't misunderstand your letters," she said. "You wrote them. Every word in them was a deliberate choice. You told me about a ranch and a future and a life, because you needed me to come here legally connected to you, before I understood that the connection you wanted was to my father's property, not to me." She paused. "You can say misunderstanding as many times as you like. It won't become true." Cole's composure was still intact. But around the edges of it, something was fraying. "The land dispute in Ohio is a legal matter," he said, "and has nothing to do with anything Robert Marsh," Carver said from the front. "You want to address that." Marsh stood. He laid out the Columbus investigation with the clean efficiency of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly how much detail a room needed to understand it and exactly where to stop before he lost them. He read the telegraph from the Federal Land Office in Helena. He explained the Briggs claim and the pattern in Samuel's documents. He was precise. He was calm. He was devastating. When Marsh finished and sat down, Cole tried once more. "These are allegations," he said. "Allegations and old grievances, and me, Mr. Cole." It was Samuel Whitaker. The old man didn't stand. He spoke from his seat in the calm, carrying voice of a man who had grown up in this valley and earned the right to be heard in it. The room went completely still. "I knew your father," Samuel said. 30 years ago, your father sat in my kitchen and made me an offer on this land that was based on a false claim he had manufactured about my deed. I have the letters in a folder that my wife kept for 30 years because she said someday it would matter." He paused. "It matters today." He looked at Cole directly. "Your father left this valley when he realized the people here weren't going to let him do what he came to do. I'm suggesting the same option to you." The room did not make a sound. Cole looked at Samuel. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Marsh. He looked at the faces in the room at Henderson, who was now sitting forward with his arms on his knees and his jaw tight. At the storekeeper, who had his arms crossed and was looking at Cole with an expression that had moved well past neutrality. At Aldridge, the banker, who was looking at his hands. Something went out of Cole's face. Not the composure that held, because men like Cole are trained to hold composure. But something underneath it, something that had been sustaining the composure, went out. He picked up his hat. He looked at Greer, who was already gathering his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows when a position is no longer tenable. "This isn't finished," Cole said. He said it to the room, or to Eleanor, or perhaps just to himself. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "It is." Cole walked out. Greer followed. The door closed behind them. The room breathed. What happened in the next hour was not what Eleanor had expected, though she would realize later that she should have. Henderson was the first. He stood up, his hat in his hands, and said that he had a loan with Aldridge's bank that he now had questions about, given what he'd just heard, and he'd like to know what Mr. Marsh thought he could do about that. Marsh said he thought quite a lot could be done about that. 2 other families in the room had similar questions. The pattern in Samuel's documents reached further than anyone had understood, and Marsh spent 40 minutes at the front of that meeting hall, turning a monthly town gathering into something closer to a legal consultation, and people stayed, and people listened, and the shape of something that had been operating in that valley in the dark finally definitively had light on it. Aldridge left early. Nobody stopped him, but his leaving was noticed. Thomas sat beside Eleanor through all of it. He didn't touch her arm or say reassuring things. He sat close enough that she was aware of him, which was its own kind of steadiness, and he watched the room with those careful brown eyes and occasionally said something brief and specific when Marsh looked to him for confirmation of a detail about the valley's land history. When it was over, when the hall was finally emptying, and Marsh was deep in conversation with Henderson and 2 other ranchers, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and he deserved the honest version, "I didn't expect to feel this way." "What way?" She thought about it. "Like it's finished," she said. "I've been bracing against something for weeks. I keep waiting for the bracing to still be necessary." Thomas looked at her steadily. "It's not," he said. "Not today." Eleanor nodded slowly. Samuel leaned across Thomas and said, "Can we go home now? My back is not what it was, and these chairs are not helping." Thomas looked at his father. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "Yes," he said. "We can go home." And that word home landed in Eleanor's chest in a specific way, the way a thing lands when it has been searched for so long that you've stopped expecting to find it. She stood. She helped Samuel with his coat because he allowed her to now, which was its own milestone. She followed Thomas out of the meeting hall into the cold Montana morning, where Foster and Jesse and the hands were waiting by the wagon, and Jesse had the particular bright-eyed expression of someone who had heard partial information from multiple sources and was burning to ask questions. "Later," Foster told him quietly. Jesse subsided. They got in the wagon. They headed east toward the ranch. The valley spread out around them clear and cold, the mountains in the distance, the creek running alongside the road. Every piece of it familiar to Eleanor now, in the way that places become familiar when you've paid real attention to them. She had been here 6 weeks. It felt in the strange accounting of meaningful time much longer. Thomas carried Samuel's folder of documents back inside when they got home and set it on the kitchen table with a care that meant something. And Eleanor saw Samuel notice the care and look away, because he was a man who had learned not to want things too openly. She started lunch. The ordinary work of it, the fire, the pot, the familiar motions felt different today. Not lighter exactly, more like itself. Like something that had been slightly off-key had come into tune. Jesse appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Can I ask now?" he said. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "I'll tell you while I cook." She told him the short version, which was still long enough for 2 cups of coffee and half a pan of cornbread she'd made alongside the soup. Jesse listened with complete attention, his red-haired head going back and forth like a man watching something important, asking questions when he didn't understand something and staying quiet when he did. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So he's just gone," Jesse said. "For now," Eleanor said. "The legal process will take time. Marsh will handle most of it. The federal land office will handle the rest. But Cole's position here is finished. He can't rebuild it." Jesse looked at his coffee cup. "Can I say something?" he said. "Go ahead," Eleanor said. "When you first got here," Jesse said carefully, "I thought you were well. I thought you were just another cook, meaning no offense." "None taken," Eleanor said. "And then I thought you were someone with a problem," he said. "Which is different but still not, you know." And then, he stopped. "I don't know exactly when it changed, but it changed." He looked up. "You're part of this place now. I just wanted to say that." Eleanor looked at the young man across the table from her 22-years-old red-haired Ernest in the guileless way of people who haven't yet learned to be embarrassed by sincerity. "Thank you, Jesse," she said, and meant it exactly. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He went back to work. Eleanor stood at the stove and felt the kitchen around her, the particular warmth of it, the smell of the soup, the sound of Samuel moving upstairs, The distant voices of the hands in the yard, the low creak of the house settling in the afternoon cold. She had arrived believing she had nowhere left to go. Standing in this kitchen now, with her statement filed, and Cole walking out of a meeting hall, and Samuel's folder of documents on the table, and Thomas Whitaker's voice saying home. Without thinking about it standing here, she understood something that she hadn't let herself understand before. She was not a person without a place. She was a person who had been pointed toward the wrong place for a long time. She picked up her spoon and stirred the soup. She heard boots on the back steps. Thomas came in from the afternoon's work, hanging his coat on the hook, and stopped when he saw her standing at the stove with her back to him. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen on his face. Not raw, not unguarded in the reckless sense, but deliberately open the way a person looks when they have decided to stop hiding something. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," Eleanor said. He took a breath. Thomas Whitaker, who chose every word the way he chose where to put his feet, took a moment to find the ones he needed. "When Margaret died," he said, "I decided that this ranch was going to be a place where work happened, not a home. Because a home required being willing to—" He stopped, started again. "Samuel stopped eating. My son stopped laughing. And I thought that if I just kept working, if I kept the ranch running and the land productive, and everyone fed and clothed and accounted for, that was enough. That was what I had to offer." Eleanor held very still. "And then you knocked on my door," he said, "in the rain, with 14 cents and a worn-out coat and a request for a position that you stated in the most direct possible terms I have ever heard from anyone." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "And you made a stew that smelled like the kitchen I grew up in. And you told my father that nutmeg adds something you can't name, but notice when it's missing." He stopped. He looked at her with those careful brown eyes. "I notice it when it's missing," he said. "I've been noticing it for 3 years. I just didn't have a name for it." He paused once more. "You're not an employee. You haven't been an employee for a while, if I'm being honest. And I'm not asking you to stay because I need a cook, or because you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere to go now. The land in Ohio, whatever it works out to Marsh, will sort it. You have options." "Thomas," Eleanor said quietly, "I'm asking you to stay," he said, "because this is your home, if you want it to be. And I don't know how to say that in a way that doesn't sound like I'm offering you something when what I'm actually doing is asking you for something." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon wind moved across the valley. The stove crackled. Somewhere in the house, Samuel shifted in his chair. Eleanor set down her spoon. She looked at Thomas Whitaker, this man who refilled the woodbin without being asked, and said her name precisely when he had something worth saying, and had driven her to town to file a statement, because the right thing was the right thing, even when it was complicated. She thought about 14 cents and a rainy porch, and the smell of a stew that reminded a man of his mother. She thought about what it meant to find a place, not because you had nowhere else to go, but because the place had found a way into you while you weren't paying attention. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She realized the same thing he had said to her 3 weeks ago in this same kitchen, when Cole's injunction had tried to make her a liability, and Thomas had stood up from his chair and said it with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table. He recognized it. She saw him recognize it. "Good," he said. "Just that. Just the one word in the quiet, deliberate voice of a man who meant everything he said." He hung his hat on the hook. He went to the counter and poured himself a coffee. He stood there and drank it while Eleanor stirred the soup, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying. The kitchen held them both warm and ordinary, and entirely itself. The letter from Robert Marsh arrived on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the town meeting. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when Jessie brought it to her, jogging across the yard, with the envelope held out like it was something fragile. She took it, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened it, standing right there in the cold morning air, because she had learned that waiting to read difficult things did not make them easier. She read it twice. Then she walked inside and set it on the kitchen table and put the kettle on. Thomas came in 20 minutes later and found her sitting with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the letter flat on the table in front of her. He looked at the letter. He looked at her face. He sat down. "Tell me," he said. Eleanor pushed the letter across the table. Marsh had written it in his precise economical hand, 4 pages, which was long for Marsh, which meant there was a great deal to say. Thomas read it without speaking. Eleanor watched his face move through it, the slight tightening around his eyes, then the easing, then something she hadn't expected to see there, which was something close to satisfaction. He set it down. "Franklin County has dismissed the injunction," he said. "Fully dismissed," Eleanor said, "with a formal finding that it was filed in bad faith. That finding becomes part of the public record in Ohio and here." "Pritchard has surrendered his license," Thomas said, "and agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced charges," Eleanor said, "which means he's going to tell them everything he knows about Cole's network. Every name, every property, every false claim going back at least 8 years. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "And your father's land," he said. Eleanor picked up her cup. "The deed is cleared," she said. The prior claim Cole's people had manufactured was dependent on Pritchard's paperwork. Without Pritchard, it collapses entirely. The land is mine. Clear title, no encumbrances. She paused. 40 acres in Franklin County, Ohio, adjacent to a railroad corridor. Thomas looked at her steadily. "What will you do with it?" he asked. The question was careful, not possessive, just careful. Eleanor looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "Marsh says I could sell it. The railroad has already made a preliminary inquiry through a legitimate agent. The offer would be—" She paused. "It would be substantial." "But," Thomas said. He heard the but. He always heard the things she almost said. "It was my father's land," Eleanor said. "He worked it for 30 years. He didn't have much else to leave." She turned her cup in her hands. "I'm not sure I want to sell it. I'm not sure I want to hold it from a distance either. I'm thinking about whether there's something else possible." Thomas nodded slowly, giving her the room to keep thinking without filling it. This was one of the things about him that she had come to value past all reasonable expectation, the way he understood that some thoughts needed to finish themselves before they needed a response. "I'll write back to Marsh this week," she said. "I want a few more days to decide." "Take the time you need," Thomas said. He picked up the letter, refolded it along its original creases, and set it back in front of her. He stood. Then he stopped. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said quietly, and she did know. She knew what he would have said if he'd kept going, and she knew why he hadn't, and she knew that both the almost saying and the stopping were equally true of Thomas Whitaker, and equally his. He went out to the day's work. Eleanor finished her tea and went back to the garden. Cole's name came back one more time, and from a direction nobody had anticipated. It was Foster who brought it 11 days after the Marsh letter coming in from town, with a face that had moved past careful into something that was almost reluctant. Which was unusual for Foster, who was a man who delivered information the way he did most things steadily and without excessive preamble. He came into the kitchen. He sat down. He accepted the coffee Eleanor poured him without his usual comment about strength. Eleanor sat across from him. "Say it," she said. "Cole didn't leave the territory," Foster said. "After the meeting, after Marsh filed the federal paperwork, we all assumed he'd go. Cut his losses, move on. Start the same thing somewhere new where nobody knows the pattern." He paused. "He didn't go." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. "Where is he?" she said. "But," Foster said, "he's been in Butte for the past 3 weeks, and he's been talking to people there, mining investors, a land speculator from Denver who has a certain reputation." He put his hands flat on the table. "He's trying to raise money, not for land this time. He's telling people in Butte that he has documentation proving he was defrauded out of a legal claim in Willow Creek by a collusive arrangement between a ranch owner and a woman who manipulated the county clerk's filing system." The kitchen was quiet. "He's going to file a counterclaim," Eleanor said. "Marsh thinks so," Foster said. "He sent a telegraph this morning. That's why I went to town." Eleanor stood up. She went to the stove, not because she needed anything from it, but because she needed to move for a moment while she thought. "He lost everything in Willow Creek," she said. "His claim on the Briggs land is under federal review. His Ohio network is unraveling. His lawyer has flipped. He has nothing left here except—" She stopped. "Except the ability to make things expensive," Foster said quietly. "A counterclaim, even a fraudulent one, requires a legal response. Legal responses cost money, time, energy." He paused. "He's not trying to win Eleanor. He's trying to make staying here cost enough that it stops being worth it." Eleanor turned around. She looked at Foster. "Where's Thomas?" she said. "Barn," Foster said. "I came to you first." "Go get him," Eleanor said. Foster went. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and felt the shape of what Cole was doing settle through her. It was almost elegant in its meanness. When you can't beat someone directly, you make the victory too expensive to hold. You make the ground they stand on feel unstable until they'd rather find somewhere easier to stand. She thought about 14 cents and a rainy porch. She thought about a woman who had been reckless enough to knock on a stranger's door and ask for a job instead of charity. She thought about what it meant to be a person who had already survived the worst that Richard Cole had been able to do to her, and who was still standing in this kitchen, and who had a clear deed to 40 acres in Ohio, and the most careful, decent, quietly extraordinary man she had ever met, about to walk through the back door. By the time Thomas and Foster came in, Eleanor had made her decision. She could see it on Thomas's face when he came in. He'd gotten the outline from Foster on the way from the barn, and he was holding it with that particular stillness of his, the kind that meant he was furious and managing it. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "Both of you." They sat. "I'm going to Butte," Eleanor said. Thomas's stillness became a different kind of stillness. "Eleanor," he started. "Not to confront Cole," she said. "To Marsh. Marsh is in Butte, which is why he was able to find out what Cole is doing. I'm going to Marsh to sign whatever needs to be signed, to give the federal investigation everything they need to make a counterclaim impossible before Cole can file it." She looked at Thomas directly. "Cole is betting that I'll sit here and wait for what he does next. He's been betting on that from the beginning. He's never once considered that I might move first." Thomas looked at her. "How long?" he said. 3 days, Eleanor said. "Maybe 4. "I'll come with you," Thomas said. "You don't?" "I know I don't have to," he said. It was exactly what she'd said to him weeks ago in this same kitchen. He said it the same way she had, not as a concession, but as a statement of fact about who he was. "I want to." Eleanor held his gaze. "All right," she said. Foster looked at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who is very carefully not smiling. They left for Butte the next morning. Jesse was left in charge of the ranch, which he received with an expression of terrified pride that made Samuel, who had come down to see them off, say dryly that he hoped the place would still be standing when they returned, which made Jesse look even more terrified, and Samuel look quietly satisfied. "Don't let Danny burn anything," Foster told Jesse. "Danny's not a—" Jesse started. "Last month," Foster said. Jesse subsided. Samuel stood on the porch in his heavy coat and watched Thomas help Eleanor up to the wagon seat with the quiet attention of a very old man who has learned to recognize things that matter. "Thomas," he said. Thomas looked up from the yard. Samuel didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at his son with those sharp, dark eyes. "Your mother would have liked her," Samuel said, simply, without ornamentation. Thomas held his father's gaze. "I know," he said. Samuel went back inside. Thomas climbed up to the wagon seat. They drove out of the yard in the cold morning, and Eleanor did not look back, but she knew the house was there behind her, and the knowing of it felt like something she carried, rather than something she was leaving. Marsh met them at his office in Butte, a precise, organized space that looked exactly like the man who worked in it and spent 3 hours going through what he'd gathered on Cole's Butte activities. It was worse than the telegraph had suggested, and better. Worse, because Cole had moved quickly, and the Denver speculator he was working with had actual legal resources and wasn't a man who made empty threats. Better, because Cole in his urgency had made mistakes, had shown documents to people in Butte who had asked too many questions, had made claims that contradicted what was already in the federal file, had used language that Marsh said was almost certainly going to constitute its own fraud charge on top of everything else. "He's panicking," Marsh said. "Panicking men make errors. He's made 3 significant ones in the past 2 weeks that I can demonstrate definitively." "Demonstrate to whom?" Thomas asked. Marsh looked at him. Then he slid a document across the desk. Thomas read it. His expression did not change, but Eleanor, who had become fluent in the language of Thomas Whitaker's face, saw something move behind his eyes that was not small. "A federal hearing," Thomas said. "Scheduled for 6 weeks from now," Marsh said. "In Helena, the territorial court with a federal land commissioner present. They're not just looking at Cole's Willow Creek activities at this point. They're looking at 8 years of transactions across 4 states. The Willow Creek case, your case." He looked at Eleanor. "Is the center of it. Because yours is the one with the clearest documented trail from beginning to end, the one with a witness pattern across 2 states, and the one with Samuel Whitaker's folder, which is the closest thing to a 30-year primary source record that the federal attorneys have ever seen in a case of this type." Eleanor looked at this document. "They want me to testify," she said. "They want you to testify," Marsh confirmed. "You and Samuel, if his health permits. And Thomas as a corroborating witness to the timeline." The office was quiet. "I'll testify," Eleanor said. She said it without hesitation because it was not a difficult decision. It had never been a difficult decision. It was simply the next thing that needed doing. Thomas looked at her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She knew what his silence meant, in the way that you come to know the meaning of a particular person's particular silence after you have paid enough attention. It meant, "I'll be there." "There's one more thing," Marsh said. His tone shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough that both Eleanor and Thomas gave him their full attention. He opened his desk drawer and took out an envelope. He set it in front of Eleanor. "This came to my office 4 days ago," he said. "From a man named Arthur Pemberton in Columbus, Ohio. He's a land developer. Legitimate one, I checked." He paused. "He wants to buy your father's 40 acres. Eleanor looked at the envelope. "The railroad offer," she said. "Not the railroad," Marsh said. "Pemberton is independent. His offer is," Marsh named a figure. The number sat in the room for a moment. Thomas was very still. Eleanor picked up the envelope. She looked at it. She set it down. "He doesn't want the railroad access," she said. "He does," Marsh said. "But he's also proposing something different. He's asking whether you'd consider a partnership arrangement rather than an outright sale. He keeps the development rights. You retain 20% ownership and a guaranteed annual income from whatever the corridor produces." He folded his hands. "It's unusual. I've looked at it from every angle, and I believe it's legitimate. He's done this arrangement with 2 other families in Ohio, whose land sits along the same corridor." Eleanor looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking at the envelope on the desk with the steady, evaluating expression of a man running numbers he hadn't expected to run. "That's not a sale," Eleanor said slowly. "That's income," Marsh said. "Ongoing. Substantial if the railroad development goes the way the projections suggest, and it keeps your father's name on the deed." The room was very quiet. Eleanor thought about her father. About 30 years of working 40 acres of Ohio farmland, because it was his, and because the working of it was its own kind of dignity. About what he would think of his daughter sitting in a lawyer's office in Butte, Montana, with a clear deed and a legitimate offer, and the choice of what to do with what he'd left her. She thought he would say to take the partnership. She thought he would say that a woman with ongoing income was a woman who never had to make a decision out of desperation again. She thought he would say that the name on the deed was just words, but what those words protected was everything. "I'll take the partnership," Eleanor said. Marsh nodded. He pulled out the paperwork. They signed everything that needed signing and were back on the road to Willow Creek by late afternoon. The drive back was longer than the drive out had felt, the way return journeys always are, but it was not uncomfortable. The mountains caught the last of the light and held it longer than seemed reasonable, and Eleanor watched them do it with the particular attention she gave to things that were beautiful without being asked to be. Thomas drove. He was quiet in his usual way, but it was the full quiet, not the careful one, the quiet of a man who was simply present, not managing anything. After a while, Eleanor said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," Thomas said. "When I got on the stage in Ohio," she said, "I had thought about it for 2 months, whether to go, whether a mail-order arrangement was something a person with any self-respect did." She paused. "I decided it was. I decided that wanting a different life was not a failure of self-respect, that asking for help getting there was not weakness, that being willing to try something unfamiliar was not desperation, even when the circumstances were desperate." Thomas said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened completely. "I was right about all of that," Eleanor said. "But I was wrong about what I was going to find. I thought I was going to find a starting point, a foot in a door, something to build from." She looked out at the mountains. "I didn't know I was going to find the thing itself." The wagon moved along the road. Thomas said after a moment, "What thing?" Eleanor looked at him. "The place where I'm supposed to be," she said. "The people I was supposed to find." She paused. "I didn't know those things were what I was looking for because I didn't know they were possible. I thought home was a place you were born into. I didn't know it was something that could happen to you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My grandfather built that ranch house in 1847. He said he built it big because he intended to fill it." He paused. "My father filled it. And then Margaret died, and I stopped believing it could be filled again." He kept his eyes on the road. "I was wrong about that too." Eleanor held that for a moment. "We were both wrong about useful things," she said. "Yes," Thomas said, "and right about each other." The road curved east, and Willow Creek appeared in the distance, small and lit against the coming dark, and beyond it, another 6 miles east, Whitaker Ranch. Eleanor felt something she recognized now, the particular feeling of approaching a place that belonged to her, not by deed or law or blood, but by the deeper, more durable logic of where a person has planted themselves and been planted in return. She was home. The federal hearing in Helena was held 6 weeks later on a Thursday in November, in a courtroom that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the particular gravity of proceedings that matter. Eleanor testified for 40 minutes. She told the same story she had told in Willow Creek's meeting hall, but in a different register, not to neighbors who needed to understand, but to a federal land commissioner and 2 territorial judges who needed the facts precisely and completely and in the right order. She gave them that. Samuel testified for 20 minutes, sitting down, because his back required it, in a voice that carried perfectly regardless, and he recounted 30 years of Harold Cole's pattern in this valley, with the authority of a man who had lived it and remembered every detail, because he had known somewhere underneath the daily business of a working ranch, and a grief that was still working, that someday the details would matter. Thomas testified for 15 minutes, and said nothing that wasn't exactly true, and said everything that was exactly true, and the commissioner asked him twice to confirm points because the clarity of his account was unusual and valuable. Greer took a plea arrangement the morning of the hearing and never appeared in the room at all. Cole appeared. He had a lawyer from Denver, a man with an expensive suit, and the confidence of someone who has won difficult cases before. The lawyer made arguments. He made them well. He made them with the full force of Cole's considerable ability to construct a plausible surface over a false foundation. Marsh dismantled each one methodically, with Samuel's documents, and Eleanor's filed statements, and the testimony of 3 other families in the valley, and the Federal Land Office's own investigation, and the Columbus records, and the surrendered testimony of Pritchard, who had decided that cooperating fully was his best remaining option. Cole sat at his table and watched it happen. Eleanor from the witness benches watched him watch it happen. There was a moment, just one, where Cole turned and looked at her. Not with anger exactly. Something more specific than anger. Something that was almost acknowledgement, the look of a man who has recognized too late that he fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. Eleanor held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at the commissioner. The ruling came back in 4 days. Cole was found liable on 7 counts of fraudulent deed manipulation across 4 states. Greer lost his land agent's license permanently and faced separate charges in Ohio. Aldridge at the Willow Creek Bank resigned 2 days after the ruling and left the territory before anyone could ask him too many questions, though Marsh had made sure the right questions were already filed with the Banking Commission. The Briggs land claim was voided. Ed Henderson's loan was referred to a banking review board that found it had been structured improperly and restructured it at terms Henderson could actually service. The federal land corridor that ran through this valley through the Briggs place and the Henderson acreage and past the creek and out toward the eastern range remained exactly what it had always been. Open land belonging to the people who had worked it and stayed and not taken what wasn't theirs. And Eleanor Hayes's 40 acres in Franklin County, Ohio, with Arthur Pemberton's name on the partnership agreement and her father's name still on the deed, sat exactly where it had always sat quietly, increasing in value alongside a railroad that was coming, whether anyone tried to steal around it or not. By December, Whitaker Ranch had changed in ways that were both visible and not. The visible ways: the kitchen garden had been properly put to bed for winter, mulched and staked ready for spring. The dining table had a cloth on it that Eleanor had sewn from fabric she'd ordered from the general store, blue and white. Nothing fancy, but present in the way that small domestic things are present as evidence that someone expected the table to be used. Samuel's room had a new curtain because the old one had finally given up entirely, and he had pretended not to notice Eleanor hanging the new one while managing to compliment the color twice in 3 days. The ways that weren't visible were more important. Jesse had started helping in the kitchen garden on Sunday afternoons, not because he was asked, but because he wanted to learn something practical, and Eleanor was the only person at the ranch who would teach him without laughing at his ignorance. Carl had started writing letters to his sister in Pennsylvania, who he hadn't written to in 2 years, and he'd asked Eleanor to read the first one and tell him if it sounded right. Danny had apparently stopped burning things, though this was attributed to a variety of causes, and Foster declined to name any one of them publicly. Samuel came downstairs every morning without exception. He ate breakfast at the table. He drank 2 cups of coffee and read whatever newspaper Eleanor had brought from town, and said several things that were either commentary on current events or dry observations about the people in the kitchen, and the line between those categories was not always clear, which was part of what made them worth hearing. And Thomas Whitaker, who had turned his ranch into a place of work instead of a home, and had been so committed to that transformation that he hadn't noticed the cost until a woman knocked on his door in the rain. Thomas had changed in the way that a person changes when they stop being alone with something they've been carrying for a long time. He talked more. Not dramatically more, he was still a man of considered words, and Eleanor did not expect or want him to become something other than what he was. But he talked. He sat at the table for supper instead of standing at the counter. He asked Samuel questions about the ranch's early history that he had never asked before, and listened to the answers with real attention. He told Jesse once in passing that he was doing good work, and Jesse's expression suggested he might need a moment alone with that information. And in the evenings when the crew had gone to the bunkhouse and Samuel had gone upstairs and the kitchen was quiet, Thomas would sometimes sit at the table across from Eleanor while she mended or read, and he would read his own papers or simply sit. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because what's in it is already full. It was a Sunday in mid-December. When it happened, the last piece clicking into place as quietly as everything in this story had moved. Eleanor was at the stove. Thomas came in from outside, stomping the cold from his boots, and stopped. He stood in the kitchen doorway and breathed in. "Ham bone stew," he said. "Ham bone stew," Eleanor confirmed. He came to the table. He sat down. She set a bowl in front of him. He picked up the spoon. He tasted it. He set the spoon down. "Nutmeg," he said. "Always," Eleanor said. He looked up at her. Eleanor was still standing at the stove, her apron on her hair coming loose the way it always did by the end of the afternoon, her eyes on his face with the directness that had been one of the first things about her, the thing that had made him answer her knock instead of pretending not to hear it. "The first night you were here," Thomas said. "I came in from the rain, and I asked who made the stew." "I remember," Eleanor said. "I asked it because I was suspicious," he said. "A strange woman in my kitchen. I needed to establish what was happening." "I know," Eleanor said. "But that's not the only reason I asked," he said. Eleanor waited. "I asked because it smelled like something I thought I'd lost," he said, "and I needed to know if it was real." He held her gaze. "You were real. You've been real every single day since. The most real thing that's happened in this house in 3 years." He paused. "I love you, Eleanor. I don't know another way to say it, and I don't need another way. I love you, and this is your home, and I would like, if you're willing, for it to be your home, in every possible sense, for the rest of our lives." The kitchen was completely still. Eleanor looked at Thomas Whitaker, this man who had opened a door in the rain and asked a single question and had no idea what he was letting in. She thought about everything that had happened since that door opened. The stew and the beans and the kitchen garden and the town meeting and the courtroom in Helena and Samuel's folder, and 40 acres in Ohio, and a letter from Robert Marsh, and a partnership agreement with her father's name still on the deed. She thought about all the places she had believed she was going, and how none of them had been here, and how here somehow was where all of it had been heading. She set down the spoon. She crossed the kitchen. She sat down across from him at the table. Their table, she understood now, because a table becomes a shared thing when people have eaten at it together long enough to know each other's habits. And she looked at the man across from her and felt every word she could say and chose the only one that mattered. "Yes," she said. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. He held it the way he did most things, steadily, without performance, with the complete attention of a man who understood the value of what he was holding. From upstairs came the sound of Samuel's footsteps moving toward the top of the staircase, and then, after a brief and pointed pause, moving carefully back away from it. Eleanor looked at the ceiling. Thomas looked at the ceiling. Then they looked at each other. And in that kitchen, with the stew on the stove, and the fire in the grate, and the Montana winter pressing cold against the walls, and not getting in that kitchen, Thomas Whitaker laughed. A real laugh, the full kind. The kind his son had apparently not heard in 3 years, and the kind Eleanor had not heard from him before, and it filled the room the way that a missing thing fills a room when it finally comes back. Eleanor laughed too, and outside the ranch sat in the cold December evening, exactly as it had sat on 100 cold evenings before, solid, well-built, intended to last. But inside, the light was on in every room. The table was set. The stew was ready. And the kitchen fire, for the first time in 3 years, was burning the way a fire burns when the people around it have stopped waiting for something and started living in what they have. Eleanor Hayes had knocked on a stranger's door with 14 cents and a worn-out coat and a refusal to fall apart in public. She had made a stew from what she found and asked for nothing. She hadn't earned and built something out of the materials available the way capable people always do. She had not found what she was looking for. She had found something larger, something truer, something that the woman on that rainy porch had not yet known to look for, because she hadn't yet understood that what she needed was not a new beginning, but the right place for the beginning she had already made. A home is not a building. It is not a deed or a bloodline or a legal arrangement. It is the people who choose each other in the ordinary moments over a bowl of stew across a kitchen table, in the quiet of an evening when nothing dramatic is happening, and everything that matters is. Thomas Whitaker had asked a single question on a rainy October night, and Eleanor Hayes had answered it. Everything after